Welcome everyone to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We have author Larry Hilton and guest interviewer Beth Common Warner from Author Connections. We welcome everyone on Facebook and in the Zoom room to this presentation. And if you have any questions for the author, please type them in the comments and he will be happy to answer them at the end of his interview. So without further ado, Beth, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am very happy and proud to know Larry Hilton and be a small part of this book. And we've heard a bit from Larry about this book before, so I'm curious about some things that you've mentioned in the past that I wanted to ask a little bit more about. The story is set in Austria, based on this family. And you've mentioned once or twice in other interviews that you spent some time in Austria when you were young. So my question is, what did you remember about your time in Austria in your youth that made you want to set the story there?
Well, first of all, I've always been a history nut. I was born in 1941, and so the war meant a lot to me. I was very fortunate to be selected when I was in college to live with an Austrian family in Vienna. They just really opened their house to me and we just had a wonderful time. And I really got to know the city of Vienna. So I think one of the really high points of the book is all of my descriptions of Vienna, especially, during the war and after the war. So I spent a lot of time just being a tourist, and the schoolwork wasn't overly demanding, so I had plenty of time to really get to know the city. Especially that was 1962. In fact, I do a chapter at the end of the book, even though the majority, by far and away, the majority is during the pre-war years and the war years, but in the conclusion, to kind of wrap things up for the reader a little bit, I move it up to 1962, when the year I was a college student there. And so I really can describe the city at that time. But yeah, I've been back to Vienna a couple of times since then. And if my health holds up, Patty and I both want to go back to Vienna again. Hopefully, when this virus is all done, we get back there. So.
You'll have to go and take a picture holding up the book in the locations that you mentioned in the story.
Absolutely.
It would be nice to have those pictures as memories. One of the things that I found really curious about the book that I think is very intriguing, because there are lots of books out there about the Holocaust or about the World War II years, and novels that have been written that sort of portray different elements of that chapter in history. And what I think is really interesting and unique about Streets of Tears is that you chose to have these two characters, the two bar children, who were Nazi supporters, who were Nazi sympathizers, and actually passionate in doing so as, the youth in Austria. So when did it occur to you that you wanted to portray it from that angle, as opposed to portraying the Nazis as, the bad guys, sort of getting into the minds of the characters and why they found themselves embracing this?
Oh, that's a very good question. And it's one that really was at the head of my whole thinking in it. I really wanted to, and Beth, you and I've had this discussion, so I won't go into it again, but I wanted to talk about the people that actually pulled the triggers, the actual people that just did the killings. What was their mindset? Where did this hatred that came from? Anti-Semitism has been, I think, probably in the world since there's been a world. I'm a big fan of the French philosopher Voltaire. He was anti-Semitic. Where did this come from? But what was different with the Austrian people and Germanic people is that it went further. It went to the killing, to actually do away with these people. Where did that come from? And so that's what I'm trying to trying to explain in this, I get to thinking that, the vast literature that you mentioned on the Holocaust, but it contains little of the people who actually were the executioners. Little is known of the actual people that did the killing.
Mhm.
And that's what I wanted to get into with my book. What was their mindset?
I found it actually kind of chilling because
Yeah.
they're the characters that you start to get to know a little bit, and you get to know their family and their background, and you're not thinking of them as monsters. You're not thinking of them as these awful, heinous characters. They're sort of people that you could almost see, almost understand, except that you know the larger context. And then, of course, you bring that out later in the book and even their own realization. So I just thought that unfolding of it and the way you looked at it and the approach that you took is very different and really interesting.
Well, thank you. And that's what I've tried to do. I just wanted to get into, what kind of people were these? And one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the book is that these weren't well-trained killers. 18-year-olds say that were, trained in the Nazi way and trained to be killers. No, these were mostly people that were the least desirable for the army. They received very little training. They were not Nazified in any sense. And I thought that was amazing. Because I had always had the impression that they were, trained killers all this time. No, they were just the opposite. But this hatred of Jews, I get back to it very early, and when I was talking about, Hitler didn't come to power until 1932, but even at the end of World War I, there's talk about how the Jews caused the loss of World War I. And Elsie Bauer, the mother of the family, wrote in her diary in 1924 that the, quote, dirty Jews of Eastern Europe had invaded Vienna. And that is true. There was a big influx of Jews from Eastern Europe into Vienna during the 20s and 30s, and that probably played a role. But the point I'm trying to make is here's Elke Bauer, which you get to know her Elsie Bauer. You get to know her throughout the book, and she's kind of like my mother. She's just is that kind of a wonderful woman. But where does she get this hatred?
Except this scapegoat element. Yeah. So this actually brings me to the next question that I have for you. When you mentioned how sometimes you have one impression and then you find out that it's something entirely different. How did you go about the research for this historical fiction? You had your own background, your own experience in the city of Vienna, but what made you, once you decided to take this thread and pursue it for a story development, how did you go about the research to make sure it was authentic and doing justice to that time?
Well, I've been an avid reader of European history during the war years all my life. I have in fact, we're sitting in it right now. I have a wonderful library of very heavily invested in books of that era. When I decided to write this, I got into more detail, especially letters, things like that I was able to find. But really, it's really just my years of reading about the situation in Europe, and especially with my spending a semester in Vienna. That put me, but that was back in 1962. But so it's been a long time coming, and I was, I've been an investment advisor for 70 years or something, 60 years or something like that. And I finally retired when I was, 68 years old or something, or I'm sorry, 72 or something like that when I retired. So I finally had time to be able to put something like this together. And that's what really helped me.
So it's funny because your answers are actually leading me to each of the next questions. It's going very smoothly. So you're a perfect guest. When you mentioned how, it took until retiring to really have the time to devote. A lot of the people who listen to Zoom Into Books and follow this program are also authors and writers who are curious about book marketing, curious about publishing. And with all respect, you just recently turned 81. Is that okay to say, right?
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago on July 4th. I mean, you look fabulous. Not that anyone would know. I just outed you. But when you're not a lover of the computer, when you're not, a very savvy technical person, and you are beyond a certain age, it's an even bigger achievement to get to where you are. It's one thing to write a draft and have a Word file on your computer, but going about editing and publishing and communicating back and forth and files and covers and everything it takes to get to where you are now, how, just for the other writers out there, the other authors out there, if you wouldn't mind, share a little bit of your experience of how this all came to fruition and you were able to manage despite some obstacles.
Well, when I was still working as an investment advisor, I wrote my first book. It was a nonfiction book. The few people that read it loved it, but I didn't do any marketing or anything like that. It was called Europe Chained by History. It was at a time when Europe, I guess I've always been fascinated with European history. It was a time just 10, 15 years ago that Europe was thinking of forming some kind of a unification. And so I had this crazy idea, and I told all my clients that Europe, what they need to do is form a true United States of Europe. So I wrote this book, and I quote a lot of Voltaire and Churchill and people like that I love and admire. They didn't listen to me, but here we are in that Europe's still in trouble. They've got a problem because they wouldn't listen to me. What I wanted them to form a true United States with all the European countries, and each country gets 2 senators and based on population representative, but they didn't listen to me, and they're in trouble now. But maybe now that I'm retired, maybe I could get more serious about marketing that book.
Oh, I thought you were going to say maybe you can go over and help run the European Union.
No, I have no.
Now that you have more time on your hands.
I have enough trouble running my household.
Okay, great. Just very interesting. So again, you're leading me from each answer to the next question. You wrote this book years ago that you just mentioned, Europe Chained by History. And how much would you say of the work that you did on that, even though that was nonfiction and really more about government and politics and leadership and, sort of these views that you have for managing these separate nations, how much of that fed into crafting the story of Streets of Tears?
To be honest with you, not a lot.
Okay, interesting.
Because the first book, Europe Chained by History, is really more of an academic book. A lot of quotes of famous people, things like that. Where this book, I really tried to make myself part of this Austrian family, and I use my semester with that family as my guide, and I really wanted to get into it. I really wanted to get into the actual killing of the people. That I think has not been adequately, even though it's a tough subject, and I know that. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't experience it through writings like Streets of Tears, I'm afraid, Beth, that it could happen again. Not necessarily to Jews, but to somebody else. Because if I can just say something here briefly. One of the things I wanted to talk about here is to get into the real details of of what happened. And I'm a big fan of French Impressionist art and art in general. But I saw, this was 2 or 3 years ago, I saw a painting that just struck me so hard that I want to finish this book with this painting. So let me just kind of backtrack a little bit here, but there's a scene and it's right at the end of the book, not the part at the, but the end of the actual story itself.
Mm-hmm.
That is really, really moving and really got to me. Elke, who's the young lady here, is the kind of the major part of the story. She had an on and off relationship with a guy named Kurt. He was in school with her, and then he went along with the whole Jewish thing, but he didn't. He just didn't want to die, so he joined the army rather than the SS and those kind of things. And he just, so he could live, he just kind of went along with the program, but in the army, not anything else. She had been up and down emotionally with her love of Hitler and Nazism. That's where her real love was, Hitler and Nazism. She spends a night, and this is now 2 or 3 years after the war is over. She's just out, she goes to jail. She's now out of jail, but she doesn't know what she's going to do for a living. Her parents were killed in the bombing of Dresden in 1945. But she's got the apartment and she's there, but she has no skills, doesn't know what she's going to do. And she meets this Kurt, and he really, really loves her, and he really wants to help her out. He's in school to become a professor at the University of Vienna. She spends a night with Kurt and has a really wonderful time until she wants to do something good for him. And he's a typical professor type student. He's got papers spread everywhere in his apartment. So she's kind of cleaning things up a little bit. And she discovers a letter that he'd received from another professor about the awful things that her brother had done to Jews during the war. She knew nothing about her brother. Her brother was a really, really bad guy. And suddenly this dawns on her, what her brother had done. She screams at Kurt, that was his name. She screamed at Kurt and suddenly ran out of the apartment. She kept running with no thought to where she was going. Soon she was exhausted. She fell on her knees in the snow. Remember, this is Vienna in the wintertime, almost hysterical from crying. Elke looked down at her hands. They seemed to be dripping with blood. Looking ahead, she saw what appeared to be a graveyard, unlike any she had ever seen. There were rows of twisted old sticks, no uniformity, poking out from the snow. It resembled headstones in no particular order. They seemed to go off in 3 rows, seemingly forever. Was this the graveyard of the Jews? A graveyard the victims of the Holocaust would never have? A graveyard for those who left behind no heirs to tell their story, because entire families perished, grandparents, parents, children. Elke looked again at her hands. More blood seemed to be dripping into the dirty snow. She continued to stare at her hands and moan. Then she passed out, falling face first into the snow. Those words really struck me. And that's the painting that I was telling you about that I had seen. It was just these sticks going off forever. And I thought, in her state, that's what she saw. And I was hoping that it will tell the reader the same thing, that because when you think about it, when you think that grandparents, parents, children, 3 generations gone, just gone for 6 million people. And to me, that's the gist of the book right there, as far as I'm concerned.
Great, wonderful. So who else did you speak with, or did you find that it was mostly your memories that helped you form the story? Like when you were doing the research for the nonfiction book that came earlier, did you speak with anyone from other countries? Did you contact some people that you had known when you were in Vienna all those years ago? Or was it mostly your memories and the reading that you've done since?
Yeah, you want to remember that first book, I was still working and I didn't have a lot of time.
Right.
I knew it was an experiment. I'd always been a reader. Could I be a writer? I didn't know. And it was an experiment, but I still didn't know if really the book, I had a really good editor that year. She was a client of mine. And when I asked her to be my editor for the second book, Streets of Tears, she was older and she just didn't want to do it. So that was the problem I kind of ran into, as you well know, with the second book, where she did a wonderful job with that first book. And I just assumed that it would appear again like it did then, and it didn't. So it took some really good editing, which I finally got.
Well, and let's not forget your live-in editor, who I think is your best manager for all of these things. Editing, logistics.
That's a great story. A great story. When I first announced to my wife that I was going to write a book, and I'm still working and everything, oh yeah, right. And she paid almost no attention, had no interest in it whatsoever. But I went ahead, and then when I did this second book, Streets of Tears, she got more interested. And now here she is, and she is now my first editor. You're my second, first editor. And she's doing a wonderful job, and I really applaud her. It all worked out, and I don't think she realized that I was this serious about writing at my age.
Well, I just wanted to share, before we wrap this up for today, I wanted to share just a little bit of what people have been saying about the book, because it has been out for a little bit now and the response has been tremendous. So just a few very brief quotes. This one is from Book Review Directory, and it says, Streets of Tears uniquely spans time to explore the lives of the people caught in the middle of this tumultuous time period that leaves them forever changed. Elke is the most compelling character in the Barr family, from her experiences as a member of the Hitler Youth to being taken prisoner by the Americans. There is a lot to explore in her life story. Chock full of history, emotion, and depth, Streets of Tears explores the pervasive, infectious pathology that killed millions. In this historical fiction novel, the setting takes center stage, immersing readers back in time that humbles us to remember the beauty and wickedness in life. So when you say that you weren't sure if you should be taking it very seriously, I would say that's one of your answers. Here's another one, just very brief, from Blue Ink Review. Not often is the story of World War II and the Holocaust told through the eyes of the other side. Streets of Tears seeks answers to such everlasting questions, as did they know of the death camps? And if so, how could they have allowed it to happen? Hilton brings style to the storytelling. Streets of Tears is a valuable contribution to our understanding of one of the most shameful and murderous eras of world history. So that's just a couple of reviews. And then I wanted to ask, what else do you have coming? Is there anything in the pipeline? Are you working on a sequel for Streets of Tears, or are you taking a break to focus on one thing at a time right now?
Well, I started out writing on the third book. I kind of wanted to, having lived in Vienna, I was always been a fan of Sigmund Freud. And so I started reading about his life and how difficult it was to get him out of Vienna as the Nazis were marching in, because they wanted to kill him. And So I've written, I wrote a couple of chapters just to the story of him and getting him out of Vienna. That's been kind of neat. The other thing that I've been studying and writing on with this third book is, as I told you early in this conversation, that I love good art, and I love especially French Impressionist art. Well, I didn't realize that the Nazis were trying to destroy French Impressionist art. Not just put it away, I mean destroy it. That was quite a story in itself. So I've been doing a lot of research on that. But I also kind of think, kind of depending upon the reaction of readers to, especially what I read to you, the last paragraph of the page, you know, what's the reaction on that? Because I'd really like to get into that more too. The years immediately after the war, and when Germanic people finally realized what they'd done, and so I don't know. We'll see. I do enjoy writing. I actually like doing the research as much as the writing. So we'll see. I mean,
the combination is working for you, the research and the writing together. I mean, this is just very impressive what you've done with this novel, and it'll be very interesting to see what you come up with next. Well, if anyone wants to keep up with you and be aware of what you're doing, your website is larryhiltonauthor.com. And you do have a page on Facebook. Anyone can just look up Larry J. Hilton Author, or just search Streets of Tears. And I'm sure that Zoom Into Books will put up the link if anyone is interested in getting a copy of the book. It makes for really interesting dinner conversation. Definitely a different kind of a twist on telling a story about the Holocaust. Larry, any final comments before we sign off for today?
No, I don't. My boss over here says no, that I've covered everything. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for being here for Zoom Into Books.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye for now.